You know, despite my reputation in the wider gaming sphere as a bit of a contrarian or a grifter or somebody who just hates every video game, I actually really enjoyed Breath of the Wild. It was definitely the best game that released in 2017, and although I did have quite a few issues with the game, ones that you've already heard before, like weapon durability and the open world feeling a little bit empty, I still think it was a unique experience, and I'm not one of the people who was desperate to return to the old Zelda formula after playing it. And so, shockingly enough, I actually was kind of excited to review Tears of the Kingdom this year. I thought it was almost certainly going to be Game of the Year, even if it did disappoint in some way. Especially given that Resident Evil 4 Remake, while a good game, is just a remake, which in my eyes means it shouldn't really be considered for Game of the Year because it's not an original idea. And Starfield is being made by Bethesda, and let's be honest, they've been disappointing most RPG fans for over a decade at this point. And while I was never the biggest Bethesda fan in the world, I did grow up playing Fallout 3 and loved it at the time. And when Skyrim came out, I enjoyed it the first couple times I played it, but eventually I did sour on it. And then, as you probably know by now if you've been watching the channel, Fallout 4 came out and was the second biggest disappointment I've ever had in my history playing video games. So they're probably going to disappoint again with Starfield. So, knowing that, how is it that Tears of the Kingdom is not the indisputable game of the year already? Well, it's the same game you already played. It's Breath of the Wild 1.5, the same map, the same progression systems, all of the same enemies from the previous game. Yes, they added a bunch of new ones too, but the sense of deja vu you get playing this, even if you only played Breath of the Wild once, is unshakable, and it truly sours this experience somewhat. But I won't go too deeply into that right here in the intro. The game is still fun for pretty much all the same reasons Breath of the Wild was fun. And now we have these goofy new building mechanics that are reminiscent of Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts, for better or worse, which some people will love, some people will probably mostly ignore, and in my case, I'm going to abuse a flying Segway every time it's even remotely viable. If you liked Breath of the Wild, you'll probably like this, and I'm sure you already bought it and played through it. Some of you even played the game a week early for free, you know who you are. But not me, I decided to do it legit, so the only tears from this game were of my wallet, as Nintendo mugged me for $70. And so originally my idea was to just play 25 to 30 hours of the game and review it and just compare it to the first in many of the core game mechanics, level design, world design, etc. Well, because of bad time management and honestly a personal desire to finish the game, I did actually want to finish it despite my many issues with it. I ended up putting in over 60 hours and completing the whole story. Now, did my opinion change from 30 hours to 60? Not really, at least not in any significant way, but at least I can say I actually completed it, unlike most of the other 30-hour plus games I've reviewed on this channel in the past year or two. So whatever, this is probably my longest intro ever, do the things the algorithm likes, and without further ado, here's Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. So, starting off with the combat, even though combat isn't necessarily a focus of Zelda games, it's still the thing I like about video games the most, no matter what genre it is, if it has combat mechanics. Long story short, it's the same exact fucking combat as Breath of the Wild. All the basic controls are the same, all of the same weapon types, all of the same animations, including basic attack combos, charge attacks, jump attacks, flurry rushes, all of that is the same. So if you played Breath of the Wild, it's not really even worth explaining in detail, but just know combat centers around blocking attacks, possibly parrying attacks, even though I almost never use the parry, and dodging attacks. And if you dodge at the right time, you get a free counter attack that is absurdly overpowered, just like it was in Breath of the Wild. Now, it isn't the easiest thing to trigger in the world, but given you'll be fighting the same enemy types throughout the game, you'll start to slowly learn the exact moment to dodge to be able to just instantly win a 1v1. But honestly, you don't really need to, because the combat itself is not very difficult. And again, that shouldn't be a surprise. Zelda combat was never difficult or complex, and it only has slightly more depth than Souls combat just because of the various different physics interactions that can play into combat sometimes. Things like pushing a boulder over a hill or dropping a heavy object on an enemy, Or in the case of Tears of the Kingdom specifically, you now have the ability to fuse any material to your weapon or your shield. And depending on the material, your weapon will gain damage and the property of the item that you glue to it. So if you glue a fire choo-choo jelly, it'll make your weapon do fire damage, as you would expect, right? And materials that enemies drop often can significantly increase the amount of damage that your weapon does. You can also turn weapons into tools. If you fuse one with a rock, you can then mine materials from the special rocks. If you fuse them with one of the various Zonai devices, it will activate the device when you pull out your weapon. So if you attach a flamethrower to your weapon, then suddenly it shoots flames as you swing and takes up Zonai energy. You can also combine two weapon types together to make the weapon have a significantly larger attack range, like combining a stick and a halberd gives you a super spear, or you can combine a halberd to a great sword to have an ultra mega great sword. Now, as cool as that sounds, it's actually not that useful because pretty much all of the weapons on the overworld have been nerfed significantly because of the gloom. So combining monster materials to weapons usually gives them way more damage than combining two weapons together. So if you hated the durability mechanic, in some ways it's actually worse in this game, because weapons are weaker by default and also break even faster. Except when you fuse them with an object, then the object on it often breaks first, extending the durability. It is a pretty interesting idea. It's just a shame that, much like Breath of the Wild, ultimately it just comes down to creating the weapon with the highest damage, and then having like a couple tool weapons, just like the rock that you could fuse to stuff to mine, but also if you had like a fire sword, or if you make a magic staff, which you can now do if you have the base staff and then combine it with a ruby or sapphire, etc., etc. On top of being able to fuse materials to your weapons, you can also now place any material on an arrow and also give it various properties, as you would expect. And there's a few unique interactions with arrows now. If you fuse Keese wings, it'll have the arrow fly much farther. And if you combine an eyeball, it actually turns into a homing arrow. And once again, I have to say, unfortunately, just like the weapons, with arrows, you're often only going to use a few arrows over and over again. Like a bomb arrow is obviously going to be very useful. Or if you're exploring the underground map, which we'll get to later, you're going to be combining these glowing light plants to the arrows because it's fucking pitch black down there. Another slight tweak to the combat is the reverse time ability that replaces the freeze time ability from the previous game. Reversing time lets you reflect thrown projectiles back to enemies that throw them. It's obviously also used for some puzzles in the shrines and things like that. Not too much else to say about it, really. Another change to the combat is the removal of the old champion abilities you got for conquering each of the Divine Beast temples in Breath of the Wild. These abilities have been replaced with the Sage's Vow, where each of the new sages accompanies you on your journey through the temples across the land, and after defeating the boss, they pledge their service to you and give you a magic ring, which summons an avatar and allows them to fight alongside you in combat. They each have some kind of useful ability that you can use roughly every 30 seconds. And yeah, I gotta say I actually like this change. The champion's abilities were actually too strong in Breath of the Wild. With the Sage avatars, you have somebody who's always useful because they do damage in combat, maybe not a lot to the later game enemies, but they definitely feel much more balanced. Neither their damage or their abilities sway the flow of combat significantly enough to break the game in any way, or at least they don't give you yet more get-out-of-jail-free cards. In fact, I would say the only thing that makes Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild's combat difficult at all is if an enemy can kill you in one hit. Because of the cooking, which I'm not going to talk about because, again, it's exactly the same as Breath of the Wild. I'm sure they tweaked it in some way, but as someone who hasn't played the previous one since it released, I didn't notice any difference. It's basically functionally the same thing. You can cook so many full heals that as long as you can pause in between attacks, you might as well be unkillable. And the champion abilities let you make even more mistakes without consequences, so the sages feel much more balanced in comparison. Now, unfortunately, the trade-off to having all these new options in combat in terms of fusing and being able to throw any material or attach said material to your arrows for various different effects, as I said before, adds a new problem to the combat that wasn't so significant in Breath of the Wild, that being the fact that now you pause every 5 seconds in combat. Pausing the fight so many different times to scroll through 100 different items just to get to the one thing you want. And yes, you can sort the item list, it still takes too long unless you know exactly what you want and it's something you've used a bunch of times before. This is mostly a problem for arrows because sometimes you don't even really know what you want to shoot. If you just want raw damage, you need to find a material that you either know for a fact you don't need to upgrade items. Yeah, that's a completely different fucking problem. Now that you can shoot and throw materials and there's a good reason to do so, you might actually accidentally get rid of an item you need to upgrade your armor. And upgrading armor seems more important than ever. This is definitely more difficult than Breath of the Wild, and we'll get into that way later in the temple section. But the end game really requires you to be prepared and to have fused together some really powerful items, as the silver variants of enemies have way more health and, as you would expect, also do proportionally more damage. So yeah, combining all of these aspects together, I'd say combat's just a side grade. The only real upgrade is that the enemy variety has been significantly increased, which I really appreciate because that was one of my biggest problems with Breath of the Wild. The enemy roster has been more than doubled, and it seems like pretty much every enemy that was in the original was brought back. But I guess that's one of the few benefits of it being 6 years since Breath of the Wild's release, is that fighting the same enemies doesn't feel as repetitive. But again, this is where the laziness starts to sink in. It's all the same exact attack animations and combos and things like that that gives this game a huge sense of deja vu. I never replayed Breath of the Wild. Personally, I don't think it has much replayability. Generally, any game that is really long is going to have less replayability by default. But in spite of that, I constantly had this sense of deja vu, which, trust me, I'll be bringing up again later. And some people will say, well, what about Elden Ring, right? It reused so many animations from Dark Souls 3. And look, I was not okay with that back then either. But in Elden Ring's defense, it did add some things, or I should really say re-add some things that were in Dark Souls 2, like power stancing. There were so many different weapon arts that were completely unique ideas and stuff. For Tears of the Kingdom, I played the combat exactly how I played Breath of the Wild. I didn't really do anything different. So yeah, ultimately combat's fine, I guess. So, of course, I have to downgrade it on principle. This is just like a Ubisoft game, man. You're playing the same thing you already played. You played Breath of the Wild, you played this, right? And that'll be a phrase I repeat in this review, no doubt. So moving on now to the open world itself. This is something that, again, I thought I would talk about at length because even though they reused the same map, they did move a lot of things around. There's completely new side quests, the Great Fairies are in different locations. There's now 2 additional maps, though calling the Sky Map its own map is a little disingenuous. It's not that much, but it's enough to keep things interesting, for sure. And the underground map is a giant fucking empty wasteland, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But before I get to the overworld or any of that shit, I want to talk about the tutorial. This has got to be the worst tutorial in Zelda history. It's to the point where streamers have actually dropped this game just because it's so unbelievably boring. I understand the purpose of it. It's to teach you some basic physics fundamentals about the new Ultra Hand ability, which lets you fuse a very large variety of objects together. But it's 3 fucking hours long, dude. That's worse than God of War Ragnarok. And while it is all gameplay, unlike God of War Ragnarok, which had like 10 hours of cutscenes throughout the game or something like that, it's very dull and slow-paced gameplay. Tears of the Kingdom pulls a Metroid and Link loses his abilities in quite possibly the dumbest way I've seen yet, which shouldn't be too surprising, but you don't even start with your fucking paraglider either for any of this tutorial. So I think the idea was okay, that using just the Ultra Hand and Fusion, you need to navigate your way around these floating islands, but it just goes on for way too long, dude. Even if you skip all the optional content, it's probably going to take you 2 hours to do it the first time, just to be able to go out into the open world. I just think the Great Plateau was far more effective and interesting, and still left plenty for you to discover in the open world. Nintendo made Tears of the Kingdom assuming that not one player would have played Breath of the Wild, and I understand people are probably going to argue with me about this, and that's fine. But I think if you make a sequel, you should assume people played the previous game. That doesn't mean there should be no tutorials. It just means the tutorial should probably be optional. The only mandatory things to teach you should be the new stuff, right? And even with the Ultra Hand, too much time is spent teaching you how it works. That should be the function of the various shrines. Because yeah, we got shrines back again. They function exactly the same. In fact, the progression system in this game is 1-to-1 with Breath of the Wild, as in, you do 4 shrines to get an extra heart container or a tiny bit of your stamina boosted, and you have to find great fairies to upgrade your armor, and obviously loot works the exact same way as well, where you find loot in chests or enemies are using them, which is yet another element that makes this game feel too similar to the last one. And when you finally get to the open world, oh, what do you know? It's the same fucking map. All of the towns are in the same place. The topography of the map is exactly the same, outside of there being some holes in the ground and some floating islands in the sky. And yes, I know you're thinking of the underground map, just hold on, we'll get to that last, because it's the worst part, believe it or not. And so, once you're finally unleashed into the open world, what is your grand task? Oh, well, it's pretty much exactly the same as Breath of the Wild. You go around to the major civilizations of Hyrule's various species, and you solve whatever weird climate problem they're having. Yeah, it literally is the same fucking thing. Well, I guess that's not completely accurate, as it turns out the Gorons have been eating some evil magic rocks that turn them into brain-dead, lazy zombies. So actually, that was kind of funny and at least a little bit creative. I'll give Nintendo some credit on that one. But to immediately take that credit away, to survive Death Mountain, you just have to do the exact same thing you did in Breath of the Wild. Buy the fire armor or make some fireproof elixirs. Instead of the climate disasters being caused by the corrupted divine beasts, they're caused by monsters that Ganondorf created that just so happen to have the power to do this, I guess. This is Breath of the Wild 1.5. It just is, guys. And I don't want to talk about the story in detail because it's not really interesting. This might actually be the worst story in Zelda yet as well. Though I'm sure people will bring up one of the 2D games or maybe like Spirit Tracks or something. I don't really care. I mean, of like the high budget 3D ones, this is probably the worst story. It doesn't even feel like a sequel. 80% of the characters who have no idea who the hell Link is, despite the fact it's only been like 5 years. Yeah, okay, all of the major players from Breath of the Wild remember Link and know he saved the world, but there's no evidence of Calamity Ganon's damage. The Divine Beasts are gone. I don't even think they're referenced in dialogue. This is a bit of a spoiler, so feel free to skip if you, for some reason, care about the story of this game. Zelda goes back in time to when Hyrule was founded, essentially, or a little bit after that. Meets the first king and queen of Hyrule, which the king was a fucking goat man, and the queen was a, we'll say, dark elf. So despite the fact that the Gerudo are clearly supposed to be like the Middle Eastern-inspired race, I guess you could say, but they might even be a different species than Hylians, I'm not sure. They could be like a Sari and just take genetic material from Hylians to make more Gerudo, right? But no, now there's actually a lot of Hylians that are various shades of brown throughout the world. And of course, one of the founders of Hyrule set the stage for the entire series, created a wonderful Wakanda-esque utopia, is one of these brown Hylians. Almost literally, we was Kangs and shit. So much for Skyward Sword being the beginning of the series. And to dip into the schizo paint a little bit, the king being a goat man, who are the Zonai people who came from the heavens, is borderline satanic imagery. I have no idea if this is intentional or not, but Japan used to be infamous for putting weird Christian symbolism in anime and occasionally video games. So this could be an extension of that, or again, if you want to take the schizo angle, this is a result of a certain cult organization full of quote-unquote elites that are subtly inserting their propaganda into video games. There's all sorts of little nuggets of wokeness, like Paya now having a giant brown boyfriend who looks like a Giga Chad in comparison to Link, despite the fact she was thirsting for his dick in the last one. Not to mention the quote-unquote subtle homosexual imagery from Breath of the Wild has been expanded even further in this one, and I already know people are gonna say I'm reading into it and no kid's gonna see this shit, but that's exactly how you desensitize people and how you groom them, right? You expose them to things. The vow that each of the new sages takes to Link looks like they're proposing to him. And Sidon, the giant shark guy, people already made a bunch of gay lewd images between him and Link when Breath of the Wild came out. Well, now, him quite literally putting a ring on his finger, and man, their relationship is too fucking weird, dude. I don't care that they literally give him a wife in the story, I'm not convinced. Link was already a cross-dresser before this game. Not to mention, an actual child, a bird child, is one of the other sages.
Hold out your hand.
Jesus, he's hand-mogged by everyone. He's hand-mogged by a child. Link was destined to be a bottom. It's over. And Riju's a Gerudo, and if you've seen any of their Rule 34, you know they're usually sporting a little something extra. Come. That's why I'm going doing your pussy tonight, Link. Though obviously that's not canon, but you get the point, man. Every character that vows to him might as well be male, figuratively. Now, honestly, I don't actually believe that, but it is weird enough to be eyebrow raising. It's certainly worth making fun of, at the very least. And perhaps more importantly than this weird schizo tangent is the fact that time travel completely ruins the story of Breath of the Wild. Because if Zelda traveled back in time, however many years, she could have just told the Hylians never to build the Divine Beast because Ganon would corrupt them and end up killing everybody, and then Breath of the Wild would never happen. Again, it doesn't feel like a sequel at all because Breath of the Wild might as well be ignored for the sake of this game's story. Another reason why this story sucks is because it has the tendency to re-explain things you already know or easily figured out early on. Not even counting the spoiler about Zelda, there's various plot details that are shown to you over and over again. Every time that you defeat a boss in one of the temples, you're given the same exact flashback with Ganondorf. And even the various tiers that give you the memories across the map show very similar scenes. Even if they're different parts of the same scene, often you'll view the actual spoiler part before you view the setup, and then the setup scene is pointless, because the arrangement of scenes across the map seems almost completely random. There's a chance that you could view the biggest spoiler in the game as the very first tier. I believe it's just directly north of the starting point of the map. But despite this, the story treats every player as if they didn't do any optional content. I remember getting to the end of the Spirit Temple and having Minoru explain something that was already told me at least 3 fucking times, and then I believe Pora repeats it again immediately afterward. Just because it's a game for children doesn't mean children are stupid. Though who knows, maybe kids really are getting dumber, but I feel like when I was a child, I didn't have to have things constantly explained to me over and over again to be able to complete a game or understand the story. Whatever, anyway, this was a huge tangent. We should probably actually get to the open world now. As I've already stated, it's basically the same as Breath of the Wild, and the reason I actually really enjoyed Breath of the Wild's open world and its exploration was the sense of discovery and the difficulty of just traversing the landscape. Now, it wasn't something overly complex, and it wasn't necessarily the focus of the game, which is what I hear Death Stranding is like, and no, I haven't played Death Stranding yet. I'll get around to it eventually, I guess. But it was never really that complex. It was just enough difficulty to make things interesting. Like not having enough stamina to climb a mountain, or that it suddenly starts raining and you slip off of any surface. Just the ability to climb almost any surface was pretty unique. And even though the map does feel kind of empty because a lot of the locations aren't really locations, who cares about a random treasure chest in a bandit camp that gives you random loot that is a sword that's gonna break in 20 swings anyway? I never liked that shit. And on that same line, getting fucking Korok seeds when there's like 1,000 of them. They're everywhere, and you really don't need to upgrade your weapon slots That's more than 3 or 4 times for the entire game. And all that stuff is back. Again, even though everything's been moved around, conceptually it's exactly the same. So really, the only worthwhile loot in the world is completing the shrines, obviously, and finding armor pieces. Now, there's various treasure hunts to find specialty armor throughout the world. I think there was probably a side quest or 2 like that in Breath of the Wild. I haven't played in 6 years, like I said. But it feels like a bigger focus in this one. There's a lot more armor pieces to find in various caves or in the underground map. There's also a new resource to upgrade battery power, which is how you power the Zonaite machines, which I might as well now talk about. This is another thing I didn't really actually want to talk about that much once I messed around with it. I was thinking, well, I'll play some of Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts because people have been comparing the building system to that. But honestly, I got bored of Nuts and Bolts within 4 hours, so I couldn't even really test out the building to any significant degree. That game is just not that good. Just know that this is not the video if you want to see people break down the crazy physics goofiness, because guess what? Dominant strategy is king. I've said this before, I think, in a video. If I haven't, well, I'll explain it for you. Conceptually, dominant strategy is just using the most efficient or effective strategy over and over again to complete a challenge in a game, right? I think a good example of this would be any good starting weapon from an FPS or third-person shooter, like the Halo 1 Magnum, or from Dead Space, the Plasma Cutter. The Plasma Cutter is a great example because it isn't objectively the best gun in the game for every situation, but it is a jack of all trades, or maybe more accurately, a king of all trades. It doesn't do the most damage, it's not the most effective at crowd control, but it is really good in almost every situation, right? So players will often focus all of their upgrades into the Plasma Cutter, making it objectively the best weapon you could be using until you max out its upgrades and then start upgrading another weapon. Now, you might be wondering what the point of this tangent is. Well, to explain that, first let me explain once again why I liked Breath of the Wild a lot. Like I said, there was a certain level of difficulty to traversing the landscape. Well, unfortunately, because of the Zonai machinery, that has been completely taken out of the equation in one very simple way, and I have to credit someone in my live stream chat for telling me about this. But you can effectively nullify all of the challenge of verticality with a steering wheel and 2 fans. Yeah, that's all it takes to create a flying Segway, which, due to how simplistic the device is, it doesn't take very much Zonai energy to power, and it's light enough to be able to fly straight up just fast enough to get wherever you want, only using a few Zonai charges. Oh yeah, and it actually gets worse, believe it or not. I was doing it wrong the entire time. You don't want to make a hover Segway, you want to make a hover bike. Instead of on the sides, placing the 2 fans, one in the front and the back, angled 45 degrees forward, not only propels you up and forward, but using the steering wheel, you can somehow turn just fine. Which fixes the one major flaw of the Segway being lack of forward propulsion, so now you can effectively move in any direction. And if you attach a giant Bright Bloom seed to it, then you've got a light for the chasm. This destroys the majority of any difficulty exploring the map. The only restriction is based on the weather, and it's not exactly difficult to get heat or cold resistant armor, or to just craft food that gives you resistance to the elements. So within a few hours of the game, you can easily trivialize any difficulty from climbing. And again, I feel like people are gonna make excuses for this, saying, well, it's optional, you don't have to do it. But if it makes everything easier, why wouldn't you do it? And it's so easy and it's so cheap to make. Because here's the thing, you might be thinking, well, what if you don't have any steering wheels or any fans? Well, in the underground, you find one of your other abilities, which allows you to save any build you've ever made, and will make that build with either nearby materials or Zonaite. And given that the flying Segway only takes 3 parts, it only costs 9 Zonaite to make. That's not a lot if you explore the underground map to any degree. And here's the thing, you can spawn this in the dungeons too. A big part of getting to those dungeons is navigating through platforming challenges to ascend super high into the sky, right? And that's a really cool idea. The problem is, if you ever struggle at any moment, you could just make your flying Segway, and boom, you've skipped half the fucking level. I'm sorry for all of you disappointed who wanted to see Synthetic Man do the puzzle right. But no, you're gonna see Synthetic Man do the puzzle wrong. Because I can. I don't have to. I have the ultimate vehicle. You don't need any other vehicles. This is dominant strategy. I'm literally going to talk about this in the video. This is a problem because it fundamentally removes one of the unique elements of Breath of the Wild, which was the actual exploration. How the landscape itself was part of the difficulty in exploring the world. And it didn't ever really feel annoying. In fact, I think it was a great thing because it helped the world feel unique. But Tears of the Kingdom doesn't have any new challenges. In fact, it has less challenges because of the Zonai machinery. And the weather works exactly the same. Get the fireproof armor for Death Mountain, get heat-resistant clothes for Gerudo Desert, and cold-resistant clothes for any of the various mountains around the map. So this is actually one of the few elements that this sequel does worse than the first game, and all because they wanted to add some stupid Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts style building crap. Now, as for the shrines themselves, I actually love the building mechanic for the shrines. It's like the complete opposite. One major problem I had with Breath of the Wild was not the fact that you had to do so many shrines, it was that a lot of the shrines were not really engaging. Partially because there was a lot of combat ones where you literally just had to fight one machine that was really strong or maybe a few machines. Now the only combat ones in Tears of the Kingdom are the tutorial ones to teach you the mechanics, which I'm completely fine with, and ones where they strip away all of your gear and healing items and then give you set equipment and you have to defeat the enemies using whatever tools they have in the arenas. And those are actually pretty good too. So the combat ones have definitely been fixed. But the vast majority of them are physics puzzles, and I feel like the physics puzzles combined with gluing objects together to making various machinery is actually really fun. Even though, just like God of War Ragnarok, I kind of had my retard moments where I overthought something very simple, or I just wasn't thinking at all because my brain melts into Swiss cheese. I don't know why, it's just a personal problem that I have. Sometimes I would come up with a very unconventional solution to a problem that turned out really well. I wonder if I can just grab a rocket from that first area. What the fuck? I just skipped the... Okay, well, I'll take it. That works for me. And the fact that you can create these out-of-the-box solutions for puzzles is really cool. And even though I'm aware of the reality that most of the people playing Nintendo games now are adults, which is kind of sad in a way, not necessarily for the man-children Redditors, I actually don't have a problem with adults playing kids games. I have a problem that kids are playing fucking Fortnite or Call of Duty instead of kids games. I think that's a bigger problem. But for the kids who are actually playing this, I actually think that could be useful in real life, or at least could help foster intelligence and creative out-of-the-box thinking. Apparently, I've become much more closed-minded over time, just getting older, given I would overlook very simple solutions to problems. I mean, in reality, these puzzles are made for kids. They should be easy to solve. But if you come up with an alternative solution, I'm glad that that's rewarded. I think that's a good idea, because I think that's really the appeal of physics-based puzzles. Now, as for the sky portion of the map, I actually like these floating islands. It seems like most of them are relatively important to do. And using the new and improved Ubisoft towers that actually launch you like 1,000 feet into the air, you can just glide straight to them once you have enough stamina, or you can build a contraption to fly you between the platforms. As you could probably guess, you can find shrines up here and also treasure maps that lead to armor. And you can also find an item that upgrades each of your sage vows, making them do more damage in combat, which they definitely need because they're a little bit too weak against endgame enemies. So the sky map is a win in my book. Good addition, there's not too much of it. The islands that are there feel relatively important, so it was good enough for me. I wouldn't really change anything. Now, as for the underground map, as I've already said before, it fucking sucks. It's an empty wasteland. There's only a few reasons to even come down there outside of a couple mandatory story moments. The first of which to find Zonaite to fuel your machines and to increase your maximum battery capacity. Enemies drop them, and you can also mine them from various sources. The second purpose being to find the different mines where the Yiga clan is stationed at. This is where I found the ability to save the various machines you made and recreate them. So that was incredibly useful for obvious reasons. And speaking of the Yiga, you also fight Master Koga in multiple different locations in special boss fights where he's using some kind of machine he's built. And those are some of the most fun boss battles in the game, so I do have to give Nintendo some credit on that one. And on top of all of this, there's also boss rematches from each of the dungeons, which upon defeat you get some treasure, obviously, and you can also fuse a piece of the boss to one of your weapons. And the third reason would be to find special loot, either by finding special treasure maps in the sky, or restoring these special statues that you can trade Poe souls in exchange for various rare items you can get. And I don't know, there's some other collectibles. I don't really remember everything off the top of my head, and I don't really care. So to sum up why this place sucks, it is way too large. It pretty much is just a reflection of the open world map if you took out 95% of the interesting locations and instead replaced it with a repeating rock texture and the glowing gloom, which reduces your maximum health temporarily until you get near some of these light plants that you have to light everywhere. And it all looks the same. There's no notable landmarks whatsoever. Even the few mines or these Yiga bases where you take them out and find schematics to build some Zonai devices, it doesn't matter. It all looks the same. It's all fucking terrible outside of the Fire Temple and the Spirit Temple and I guess under Hyrule Castle, if you want to count that. I'm really not exaggerating when I say 90% of it feels completely pointless, like fluff. There's really just no purpose to this fucking place. It feels half thought out. It's funny that one of the biggest praises I've heard of this game over Breath of the Wild is that it fixes a lot of the problems in terms of worthwhile content and plugs up some of the emptiness of the open world map. But then you have the underground map, which is the exact fucking opposite. It's way more empty than Breath of the Wild ever was, which I feel like cancels out the fact that the overworld map is better. It pretty much defines everything I hate about certain types of open world games, where there's just nothing here. There's no worthwhile quests whatsoever. The enemies are often a waste of time to fight. And actually, it's worse than a waste of time. It's annoying, too, because every time they hit you, they reduce your maximum health, just like the Gloom. It's just busy work in between notable locations. Now we get to the final part of the open world, the temples. Now, if you were one of the people who complained about the divine beasts in Breath of the Wild, unfortunately, you're probably not going to like these temples that much either. I definitely think they're better than the ones in Breath of the Wild. There's more variety between them in how you get to them and the style of puzzles in each one. But they're still really not that great. Definitely not all that memorable because the design of them is very similar to the shrines in that you can approach them in different ways and have unconventional solutions, including using the Segway to skip a lot of them. I started off by doing the water temple despite the fact it was clearly supposed to be the third one in terms of difficulty, and I definitely paid for that as the enemies there could kill me in one hit. But what was more interesting about this whole sequence was actually getting to the temple. The fact that you had to solve a riddle to figure out how to get to these sky islands, and then it's a platforming challenge, which I ended up ignoring with the Segway, but still, the idea of swimming up a bunch of waterfalls to get to the top was pretty cool. Then the temple itself was a series of mini puzzles, and then you fight the Mukto Rock, which was a surprisingly easy boss given how difficult the normal enemies were in the area. I beat him in one try, despite the fact I died probably 5 times on my way to him. Then the next temple I did was the Wind Temple, which is the one the game intends for you to do first. In fact, it even tells you to go there first. and as expected, it was much easier and much shorter in general. Just getting there involved climbing up a mountain, finding the bird dude from the last game's son, and you and Bird Boy team up and go through another platforming challenge in the sky, this one being a lot more fun. And there's an airship stuck in a tornado, which once again you solve some simple puzzles and fight a cartoonishly easy boss. And they're gimmick bosses too, which I guess isn't too surprising. This is Zelda. They basically invented gimmick bosses. But for the Air Temple boss, you just glide below him, then shoot his belly in 3 different spots. As for the Water Temple one, you just have to use Sidon's water ability to hit him 1 time, and then you get to bash the shit out of him, and you just repeat that until he's dead. Fairly simple attacks, not hard to avoid by any stretch. Now, Death Mountain was actually a little bit different. There wasn't actually any platforming challenge unless you count climbing to the top of Death Mountain. Instead, you fought a mini-boss, 3-headed magma dragon thing, which was cool, but it was over in like a minute. And then the temple itself is inside of the abyss instead of the sky, and I guess as another mini platforming challenge, you have to make your way to the temple. And then the temple itself could also technically be considered a platforming challenge, I guess, if you decide to not even engage with the minecarts. Against my better judgment, I decided to use some restraint and didn't use my magical flying Segway, but I did just straight up climb up a few of the walls instead to get to the various gongs, and then the boss is a rock version of Goma, which is incredibly easy to kill. I was over-equipped a bit, to be fair. Now, originally, this is where I would have ended my playthrough of this game for the sake of the review, but I have to repeat myself once again due to bad time management. The review was not ready last week, so instead, I decided why not just finish the game at this point. Well, in comes an 11-hour straight stream, as the game turned out to be much longer than I had anticipated. The Gerudo Desert section of the game was probably the least interesting of the 4, with the weather gimmick this time being a massive sandstorm, which blocks your vision unless you climb above it, and it also blocks out your map. Which sounds like it might be an interesting challenge, but in reality it's actually pretty easy to climb above the sandstorm, and so you make your way to Gerudo Town. Thankfully this time you don't have to cross-dress to get in, and you end up having to help Riju hone her lightning powers. Then you set up a defense against the army of Gibdos, which are like these skeleton guys that you have to hit with elemental damage before you can deal physical damage. And then after that, you head off to the temple, which is just like all the other temples where you do a series of not so difficult puzzles, and then you fight the Gibdo Queen boss. Now, the Gibdo Queen actually is one of the more engaging boss battles in the game, with the gimmick not completely paralyzing the boss. Thank goodness, it's actually a challenge. I was slightly annoyed, admittedly, just because they also throw 20 enemies at you about halfway through the fight, which absolutely destroys the frame rate, which makes the game very frustrating to play. But unlike the other temple bosses, you actually had multiple ways to approach this one. You could hit her with lightning or fire, or you could reflect the light beams at her to make her vulnerable. My only complaint is she had one straight up fucking busted attack with a hitbox that covered 180 degrees in front of her, which is just absolutely ridiculous. It's one of like 3 total attacks that she has, so she spams it over and over again. So once you've gathered the 4 sages, you think, okay, it's time to fight Ganondorf and end the game. Well, the game fakes you out. If you viewed all the memories at this point, you know that Ganondorf can make a fake Zelda, and that's exactly what happens. You end up having to fight a bunch of Phantom Ganons, which was a cool fight. But then, you have to find the 5th sage, which turns out to be Raru's sister. So for the furries in the audience, they get their demonic goat waifu, and her spirit still exists thousands of years later, and you form a metallic body for her in the Spirit Temple, which was kind of cool. Basically, the Spirit Temple's gimmick was a series of mini shrines where you just have to deliver her body parts, and then you get a mech buddy, which was a cool idea, except that it kind of sucks. And then the boss is just a corrupted, slightly bigger machine body. And now you're finally ready for the final boss, and for those of you who saw the stream, you know exactly what happened next. I had been streaming for like 10 hours straight at this point. It was like 4 in the morning. I was dead tired, and I had wasted all of my good resources, all my cooking, most of my good weapons, because I thought the game would be over by now. And I ended up failing at 5 a.m. because I completely ran out of healing items. So I played for 3 hours off stream to prepare, and it turns out I over-prepared. I had way more healing than I ever needed. I beat Ganondorf in one try, but I'm not going to use this as a criticism against the boss because I definitely think it was a better final boss than Breath of the Wild's. Calamity Ganon was a pushover after you'd done the 4 temples. At least this Ganondorf gives you a little bit of a challenge. I mean, it's certainly no Souls game, but the battle is long enough to wear through a lot of your resources, especially if you didn't know to cook a bunch of Sundelions beforehand, as all of his attacks do gloom damage, and a few of his attacks even take away a heart container for the rest of the fight. And once again, here's spoilers if you want to skip to the conclusion, because I'm pretty much just going to be talking spoilers for the rest of the video. Ganondorf swallows his magical tear stone that gave him all of this immense power, and it turns him into a massive dragon just like Zelda. Yes, Zelda's a fucking dragon in this game. It's really stupid and just adds yet another plot hole to the story because Zelda doesn't time travel back to the present. No, dragons are immortal, which means that during Breath of the Wild, there would have been 2 Zeldas, with the light dragon, I guess, just fucking off. Because obviously Nintendo didn't think of the story ahead of time, which I guess shouldn't be surprising. Nobody plays Zelda for the story, but this one, I gotta say it again, it's a dumb story. So while you're riding on Dragon Zelda, you have to fight Dragon Ganondorf, and all you do is fly on his body and hit his weak spots with the Master Sword. Again, pretty anticlimactic, despite the increased stakes, despite the power creep of Ganondorf being probably more powerful than any other iteration of the character. It still kind of comes across as a shitty final boss fight, because the actual human form of Ganondorf just wasn't challenging enough. I will give Nintendo some credit that this whole final boss sequence felt very anti-speedrunner, because not only do you have to skip a huge amount of enemies on the way to the final boss, end-game enemies no less, that could kill you in one hit at the beginning of the game, but you also have to defeat an army of moblins, which you would be doing without the sages if you're doing it from the beginning of the game, and then you have to beat 3 forms of Ganondorf. So, seeing a speedrunner beat this game from the beginning, with no upgrades, no weapons, and without some kind of glitch that skips forms of the fight would actually be pretty impressive. But I don't know, this ending just wasn't really very satisfying. I don't really care about Zelda in these games. Honestly, she's the worst girl. And they even ruined a couple of the good girls from Breath of the Wild in this one. So it's really just down to Pora or Riju as the waifus. And of course, they don't really seem to show romantic interest in Link. So yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with this. The point is, I wasted another 20 plus hours on this game, and my opinion is virtually unchanged since I started recording this review. Now, because I feel bad that I spent so much time shitting on this game, despite the fact I think it's pretty good, I'll at least name a few highlights from my playthrough to sort of even this out. Like I said before, the overworld map feels a lot more filled out than Breath of the Wild. There were a lot of little highlights of my exploration, like revisiting the Great Plateau and fixing one of the Bargainer statues. Even though it was a little annoying to build contraptions to bring the eyeballs back to it, that was still a cool quest. I hesitate to call this a highlight, but I find it very interesting that Zelda stole Link's house in Hateno Village. I don't know, it's just kind of funny, and it does serve a purpose. You discover how to get the Champion's Tunic in this one. Then there's getting into the Lost Woods from the underground. That was actually a pretty cool idea to subvert your expectations if you played Breath of the Wild, and it was just a good use of the underground map for once. And you also find out through that quest that the Master Sword is stuck in the Light Dragon's head, which, again, if you're paying attention to the memories, you know is Zelda. And instead of requiring heart containers to get the Master Sword, it now requires stamina, actually giving you a reason to upgrade stamina in this sequel. Another cool moment was killing your first Gleeok. These are the 3-headed demon dragons that are across the map, each a different element. Unlike the Lynels, where it seems like more of a test of memorizing the boss patterns, the Gleeoks are more like a test of how many arrows do you have and how much are you going to abuse slowing down time with said arrows. So not exactly the same type of satisfying challenge, but still, facing a dragon with a super strong elemental attack was cool and fun. Definitely one of the better new enemy types. Another exploration area I really enjoyed was the maze that was in Breath of the Wild, which had super high walls that you could actually climb to the top of. Well, in Tears of the Kingdom, using Ascend, you can just fly straight through the ceiling, which of course Nintendo thought of, so even if you manage to climb to the very top of the center of the maze, turns out there's a second maze, a Sky Maze, where you have to activate 4 terminals, and then once you activate those terminals, you free fall and go into an abyss part of the maze where you fight a mini-boss, and then you're rewarded with Ganondorf's armor from Ocarina of Time. And probably the final interesting optional quest was the Skyward Sword themed one, where you have to fix the giant goddess statue by going to 3 altars that represent the Triforce, offering a piece of the 3 elemental dragons, and then you're rewarded at the end with the Skyward Sword fee, right? Which eventually becomes the Master Sword. Now, as I implied earlier, I have no idea how the hell this is supposed to fit into the Zelda timeline, especially since Skyward Sword is implied to be the real founding of Hyrule, but this game retcons it by having Rauru be the founder of Hyrule, and Demise comes before Ganondorf, so is this implying that everyone from Skyward Sword died off without founding Hyrule? I don't know, I don't really care about the Zelda timeline that much, but still, was a kinda cool quest, good reward, even though the Sky Sword is basically just a normal reskinned sword. It's not special like the Master Sword in any way. You can even just fuse any monster part with it, which is kind of stupid, but I don't know, I like throwbacks to the other Zelda games. Even though I'm not a massive Zelda fan, I have finished a few of the other games, so I'll take the references I can get here. Now, as for the more minor issues with the game, one of the big ones for me personally is the soundtrack. I thought the exact same thing of Breath of the Wild, but it's still another minimalist, ambient soundtrack, with the only notable tracks being remixed ones from older games in the series. Another minor issue is the voice acting, which is just as bad as Breath of the Wild's. I think that's something we can all agree on. A common complaint I've heard about lack of meaningful side quests. I don't completely agree with that, but I think it's half true. Half the side quests are significant and worth your time, and the other half are not. I guess the biggest complaint I have with them is they're maybe a little too simplistic, as in you go here and find this thing. That's pretty much all of the side quests. And while realistically I wouldn't call this a minor flaw by any stretch, I gotta bring up the performance issues. As we all know by now, the Switch is an underpowered piece of crap. It's a handheld masquerading as a console. This game struggles to hit 30 frames at pretty much any time. If you're traveling the open world, it might as well be hovering around like the mid-20s or something. It's certainly not consistent on any level. Even combat against just 1 or 2 enemies will sometimes dip below 30. The only reason I qualify this as a minor issue is because if you decide to emulate the game legally or not, then you could probably actually get it to run at 60 frames with a powerful PC. And I think that pretty much covers it. So in conclusion, should you buy Tears of the Kingdom? Not at full price. Yes, I know some of you are going to say, but it has like 100 hours of content, dude. For me, that's totally worth $70. That is a mid-wit take, and it has always been a mid-wit Zoomer take specifically. I will take a 10-hour masterpiece that has replayability over a 60-hour bloated Ubisoft sequel any day. I feel like people have no respect for the quality of their time. I don't care if something takes me 100 hours to do if it's not fun. And look, Tears of the Kingdom is a fun game, but it's also highly derivative. I'll say it one last time, it's Breath of the Wild 1.5. The main improvement to the Breath of the Wild formula is increasing the number of goofy ways to interact with the world. Between the crazy contraptions and fusing weapons together, it seems like Nintendo wanted to minimize repetition in this game as much as possible. The main problem with that is that most gamers, from the most casual player to the most hardcore speedrunners and challenge run types, are going to employ some level of dominant strategy. Like I explained earlier, people are going to migrate to the most efficient way of playing a game as possible, especially if the game is long, and this is long as fuck. Yes, there's a minority of players who love messing with sandboxes in video games. The types will waste 100 hours fucking around in GTA or setting up complex redstone machines in Minecraft. And I don't have a single problem with the actual building mechanics. They're just not for me personally. They take too much time. They don't really provide any real advantage over playing the game normally, at least not something that you can do very quickly or without a sufficient cost of Zonai, right? For me, the moment a chat member told me about the flying Segway, the verticality of this game was basically dead to me. Half the fun of Breath of the Wild was traversing the world, and now I had a cheat code. The main problem with this game is that despite being a sequel, it doesn't feel like one. It only fixes one major problem from Breath of the Wild, and that was the lack of enemy variety. All of the complaints about weapon durability, the shrines being repetitive, the map feeling empty, the lack of meaningful side quests, the dungeons not being real dungeons, the bad voice acting, the boring soundtrack, and probably even more problems that I'm not thinking of, were not addressed. It actually, in some ways, is lazier than a Ubisoft sequel, because at least Far Cry 4, 5, 6, all the Assassin's Creeds, they take place in different locations, different landscapes, all that stuff is new. This is the same fucking map from Breath of the Wild. I can't say that enough. It doesn't matter if you change everything that's on the map. Imagine if Bethesda makes Elder Scrolls 6 and it's in Skyrim again. I don't care if it has all new quests. Even if cities were moved around, it would still have that deja vu feeling that you can't shake off while playing this. Even if you quote-unquote debunk half or even 2/3 of my complaints in this video, it still would not be a 10 out of 10. Even if all of my complaints were invalid, I would argue it's still not a 10 out of 10 just because it's in the same fucking map as Breath of the Wild. And I can't believe anybody is still dumb enough to post Metacritic scores at this point. We've all known that game reviewers can't be trusted. They're effectively paid off, even if they're not literally given money for the reviews. Now, all of that negativity being said, it is still a fun game for all of the same reasons that Breath of the Wild was a fun game. The reward of exploration, a map that actually feels different in every region, different biomes, different difficulties of traversal, usually being the weather or the difficulty of flying through the sky in some way, though as I said, the Segway nullifies the verticality issues. And the combat itself is fun. It's fun to fuck around. And personally, I actually do like the gimmick dungeons. I like the Sky Map. I think that's a really cool idea. I wish there was more of that stuff. So ultimately, it feels like reviewing this game is almost a waste of time. If you liked Breath of the Wild, you'll like this one. If you didn't like Breath of the Wild that much and thought it was overrated, this is just more the same. But I definitely see the appeal of this. It doesn't quite do it for me. There's still way too much repetitive, pointless content, much of side quests without any meaningful motivation to them. They're glorified fetch quests. I don't care about any of the quest givers. I don't care about the actual objective itself. I just want the loot. And even though I think the loot actually was significantly improved in this, just because of all the new armor sets, the weapons still ruin that quite a bit. The fact that all your shit can break makes you not want to actually use anything good, and so you waste all your weaker weapons first, which just draws out the kind of repetitive combat even longer. And you see what I mean about this game. Every time I want to compliment it, I just go down a rabbit hole of these various issues. But regardless, I understand its appeal as a chill game to play. This is a game you play when you just want to play something relaxing. You want to explore a world that has over 100 hours of content, kind of like a Bethesda game, but without any of the real interactivity. But it has the unique angle that Breath of the Wild had with all these physics interactions, your various puzzle-solving abilities. The shrines legitimately are fun. I am one of the people who will defend the shrines to a point, because most of them actually feel pretty well designed, and after a certain point, you know you don't need to do any more. I did probably 20 more than I ever had to do, and that's because I kinda like doing them. So I don't really care if you love the game. I enjoy the game personally. I think it wore out its welcome after a certain point, but I absolutely get the appeal. I just don't think it is a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination. I think the global standard for video games has significantly decreased over the past 5 or 6 years. And now basically any good game is now a masterpiece. That's all it takes to be considered one of the greatest games ever made, is to just be good or to just have over 100 hours of content, as somehow quantity is now more important than quality. Now normally I would end the video here, but I actually have to talk about the state of the channel for a moment. If you tune into the streams, you already know my channel has been shadow banned for probably close to 6 months at this point. And so the channel's hurting for views because basically the only people seeing the videos are the core fans who always watch my videos. I don't really get recommended in the algorithm anymore. So because of that, making these longer videos is not really rewarding anymore. I honestly have always put a little bit too much effort into editing given how low quality it is, if that makes sense. So in the near future, I'm probably going to switch to a lower effort style, meaning that my audio is probably going to stay about the same, though I might spend less time correcting certain mistakes. But the main thing you'll notice if you're actually watching the videos, not just listening to them, is I'm going to be using a lot less clips. I'm going to try and still have something show on the screen that is relative to what I'm talking about. But as it stands, it takes me way too long to make these videos, given that I now make only half as much money as I used to make, not accounting for all the stream donations. So the good news is you're probably going to see more content in the next few months, but the bad news is the quality of the content will be lower if you care about the fine details, if you really actually pay attention to my videos. So I do apologize in advance, but it's just the nature of YouTube, man. I got way too edgy in the live streams, now I'm paying for it. It's fine. I'd rather be as honest with you guys as possible, even if I go deep into the conspiracy theory paint sometimes. So for some of you, you may not even notice a change, but for others, yeah, I'm just apologizing in advance. But that's just going to be the way it is for the near future, unless I get unshadow banned at some point. So, see you next time, guys.